When done right, found footage movies can be hugely effective, and a good filmmaker knows how to bend the rules of the genre to deliver genuinely innovative experiences all horror fans need to see. Now, just to clarify a few things before we jump straight in. First, there'll be no screen movies like Host or Unfriended here, because while you definitely should watch them before you die, they both reflect a new horror subgenre in its own right. Likewise, Cannibal Holocaust and the Blair Witch Project are the two biggest influences on the entire genre and have been talked to death, so they make it on the list here as honourable mentions. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are found footage horror movies you should see before you die. What We Do in the Shadows. Now an MCU mainstay, Taika Waititi started making waves with his second feature, the found footage horror comedy What We Do in the Shadows. Teaming up with regular collaborator Jermaine Clement, the pair co-wrote and co-directed this hilarious mockumentary about a group of socially awkward vampires just trying to live their best undead lives. If you're familiar with Waititi's other movies, or even his work on Flight of the Conchords, then you'll be aware of the kind of dry, witty humour that drives the entire tale. The found footage format here isn't used to sell the intensity of the scares, but rather to accentuate the kind of cringe humour found in something like The Office. That's because while our heroes are, of course, vampires who feed on human blood, they're also bogged down by the same kind of issues that everyone encounters in a flat share. Someone won't wash the dishes, another plays their music too loud, and another still never cleans the stains out of the carpet after they've had a blood orgy, you know, the regular issues. What We Do in the Shadows is a movie committed to showing vampires from a different angle, and the juxtaposition between the gothic horror of the premise and characters makes for a unique found footage offering. Paranormal Activity 3. Paranormal Activity is of course one of the biggest names in found footage, but which entries in the franchise are the real deal and which haven't stood the test of time? While the first is the most influential, it's also a touch tame by today's standards, and the limitations of its budget are on full display. It's still decently effective, but Paranormal Activity 3 builds on the foundation of the first two flicks and adds in novel new scare tactics and an interesting period setting. Bigger, of course, isn't always better, but unlike other sequels, Paranormal Activity 3 uses its increased budget and studio backing to attempt something different. As a prequel, it fills in the blanks of Katie's story more explicitly, diving into classic horror conventions of cults and compromised parents in the process. Its climax as well is one of the best in the series, paying off the building dread in a completely terrifying way. If the franchise had ended here, honestly, it would have been a high note to go out on. Afflicted. One of the most exciting things about found footage movies is watching directors adapt conventional genres to fit the new framework. Afflicted then uses this style to give us one of the more interesting takes on the regular vampire story, as two friends encounter a mysterious illness while abroad. The vampire part is initially kept ambiguous, and Afflicted at first appears like your regular possession or body horror movie, as the infected party starts transforming into something less than human. Despite their zombie-like appearance though, it eventually becomes clear via a thirst for human blood and a distaste for sunlight that the ailment is vampiric in nature. What's so great about Afflicted is this novel depiction of vampirism in general. There's nothing romantic about the transformation here. It's presented as quite literally a disease, one that distorts the humanity of its host physically and leaves them terrifyingly vacant and animalistic. Think less Dracula and more like the monsters from I Am Legend. The Sacrament, a found footage story about a man leading a small news crew to a cult in the hopes of finding his sister. Like most of West's movies, the pace is initially slow, foregrounding the characters and their very human drama. The director takes the time to really establish the inner workings of this cult, and why they're so devoted to their leader, a man only known as the Father. Gene Jones is captivating as this enigmatic pastor, and the extensive interviews with him conducted by the crew show the insidiousness at the heart of his conduct, and the bubbling menace surrounding his true intentions for the people who are flocked to him. There is plenty of tension to be found in watching these protagonists navigate a space where they absolutely do not belong, and more importantly are not wanted, which eventually explodes as the cult plays its hand in a devastating climax. Creep and Creep 2. I don't know what it is about mumblecore actors and found footage that go hand in hand, but after Joe Swanberg in VHS 1 and The Sacrament and Mark Duplass's Creep movies, there's definitely a trend and I'm not complaining. Now, while you might have heard of Creep and its sequel, both are best experienced knowing as little as possible about where the story is going. The original movie has a fascinating premise for a found footage movie that surprisingly justifies why the story had to be told this way. Essentially, Mark Duplass plays Joseph, a man who hires a freelance videomaker to create a small diary of his final days to give to his family before he dies from a terminal illness. The thing is, it quickly turns out that while he's clearly got a sympathetic backstory and seems to have hired this person for noble reasons, Joseph is a total weirdo, a creep if you will. What follows is an exploration of the strange relationship between these two men as Joseph's behaviour gets increasingly erratic and holes are poked in his previous sympathetic testimonies. The sequel too is one of the rare follow-ups that lives up to the first movie. It never just retreads beats that came before and instead pushes the characters forward in surprising ways. Lake Mungo. This ghost story all about the drowning of a young girl called Alice is a slow burn masterpiece. Unlike other found footage movies on this list, the framing of Lake Mungo is a little bit more inspired. It's less a first-hand account of events and more a documentary-style presentation of what Alice's family went through following the death of their daughter, comprised mostly of talking head interviews. In that way, then, it's closer to The Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel than Paranormal Activity, but it's still full of effective dread as the supernatural aspects impose themselves further as the story delves deeper into Alice's past. The true crime framing also centralizes the family's own drama and emotion at the forefront of the story, which gives the entire movie a strangely believable vibe. You don't see these characters as actors, and as such, it's surprisingly easy to take everything at face value. Its methodical pace won't be for everyone, but if you're a bit sick of the nausea-inducing style of the other horror films on this list, then Lake Mungo is a terrifying palate cleanser. Wreck. An absolute giant of the subgenre, Wreck continues to be one of the best horror movies of its kind so many years later. A zombie film about a news crew suddenly quarantined in an infected apartment block, Wreck doesn't really put a foot wrong. The build from the appearance of the first zombie to being chased room to room by the whole horde keeps the adrenaline high. But in between the violent set pieces, there's also a surprising amount of world building going on as well. The directors could have easily thrown a camera crew into a zombie-infected building and just called it a day, but instead they added an element of religious horror into the mix with the Catholic conspiracy that underpins the origins of the virus, allowing this specific story to stand apart from so many other zombie tales. The first sequel too is really good and an essential companion if you enjoyed this initial outing. VHS 2. Anthology movies are difficult to get right. So often they're killed by inconsistency, with great segments leading to disappointing ones that ultimately leave the viewer wondering whether the time would have been better spent fleshing each short out to feature length. VHS 2, however, is proof of why this subgenre can be so successful. Learning from the mistakes of the original installment, itself suffering from inconsistent quality, this follow-up brought together some of the best directors working at the time to deliver spine-tingling segments that revel in entirely different flavors of found footage horror. Opener Phase 1 Clinical Trials offers a unique spin on a regular ghost story, with the found footage here coming from a camera implanted in a man's eyeball, Black Mirror style. It sounds ridiculous, but the haunting itself is chilling, and the implant adds an extra wrinkle to the tale. The standout, however, is Gareth Evans' Safe Haven, which follows a documentary crew who venture to a cult complex to interview their mysterious leader. The longest segment of the movie, this documentary soon devolves into an apocalyptic nightmare as the cult executes its endgame, delivering one twist after another via some superbly gory and surreal imagery, including a demonic birth for good measure. VHS 2 boasts hit after hit and still leads the pack when it comes to anthologies.